Thank you for tuning in. This is DJ Fobfresh from SegaShiro.com, and today we're continuing our old school retro coverage on the Sega Saturn. This is Iron Man Manowar in heavy metal. So this particular Iron Man title was published by Acclaim and developed by Real Time Sports and Real Time Associates. It was launched on the PlayStation, the Sega Saturn, the Game Boy, the Game Gear, and DOS back in 1996. Iron Man and Manowar in heavy metal is essentially a side-scrolling action shooter for up to 2 players, and if you bring a friend along, you're just punishing them. Essentially, this title merges both Marvel and Valiant comics in one sort of package. In fact, probably the most interesting thing about this game is the background to Acclaim Entertainment and the Valiant series of comic books than anything else. So essentially at one point in time, one of the Marvel editors left Marvel and created Valiant Comics, which had characters such as Shadow Man, which you might remember from the Dreamcast, Manowar, and Turok. And in the mid-90s, so about 1994, Acclaim actually bought Valiant and brought all those properties in-house and then started creating video games from them. Now, Valiant Comics is one of the only comic book companies, at least at the time, to even get close to challenging DC and Marvel for their supremacy. At one point, Valiant market share was up to 12%, while DC and Marvel held 16 and 30% respectively. Now, Acclaim paid $65 million for Valiant Comics back in 1994, and 2 years later they must not have had any budget left because this game is a clunker. It is so mediocre that it barely registers, it's barely worth your time. But what's most surprising is that this is a game that comes out after Maximum Carnage, which on a 16-bit console looks a heck of a lot better than this Iron Man title does. Comic books are known for their aesthetic and art quality, and none of that comes through in this game. The characters are ugly, the backdrops are ugly, and by ugly I mean there's canned animations, and the characters themselves are kind of blocky, and you can't see any detail. In fact, they come off as lifeless and dull. So much of this game comes off as lifeless and dull. Never once in this game do you actually feel like you're controlling a powerful superhero. In fact, Manowar and Iron Man come across as clunky and rather slow. In fact, they're merely interchangeable, mere ugly palette swaps of one another. This comes nowhere near to utilizing the power, especially for 2D graphics, that the Saturn is capable of, and it's a real disappointment in that regard. If I had to choose one thing about the graphical presentation that actually looked inspired, I'd have to say the explosions. Why the explosions? Because the explosions in this game actually kind of remind me of Aqua Teen Hunger Force, which is something on television that I'd rather watch than play this game. Now, graphics are one thing, but the gameplay is just as bad. In fact, it's so incredibly uninspired. There's nothing that you can play here that you haven't played somewhere else before, or played in a version that is 1,000 times better. In one sense, the gameplay is functional. I mean, Iron Man and Manowar can jump, they can punch, they can shoot. They have an unlimited supply of laser beams that they can shoot out the palms of their hands. Those things can be upgraded. You can get through icons that you find around the map. There's health icons that restore your health. You also have your thrusters, and you can float into the air, and that uses up fuel. And you can also find more fuel throughout the game. And of course you have your unibeam that you blast out your chest. And despite all of those little options and those upgrades, it still doesn't get any better. It's still incredibly mediocre. And that's probably the worst thing. It's one thing to be a bad, terrible game, a game that misses the point so much that it ends up being funny. Iron Man and Manowar in heavy metal is a game that on one level is technically proficient and yet is missing heart, soul, and fun. The only brief, small moment of fun that I might have had in this title actually occurred during the shoot 'em up stage that you can see above. Except all it did really was to serve to remind me of the many better horizontally scrolling shooters that are on the Saturn. Now, even the save system in this is kind of clunky. It uses a password, so you have to write an unbelievably long code. to kind of keep your game progress. Considering that the Saturn had onboard RAM, it's a little bit annoying. In most other games, the heavy metal soundtrack would come off as a bit generic. However, in this one, it comes across as being the best part about it, because it's the least offensive. The storyline is wafer thin. It's very forgettable. It is essentially told to you in text-based screens at the start of each level. Even if you never saw them, you would have some vague idea of what's actually going on in the game. I can only think that the developers thought this would sell simply because it amalgamated Manowar and Iron Man together. However, Iron Man deserves much better than this. In fact, this game makes the now defunct Sega Studios title look brilliant in comparison. This is DJ Fob Fresh signing out, playing bad games so you don't have to.